My name is Sarah Rooker, and I'm the Director of Norwich Historical Society, and welcome to First Wednesday. Before we get going, I'm going to ask you to please be sure your mobile devices are all turned off. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council, and it's co-hosted by the Norwich Historical Society and the Norwich Public Library. It is supported statewide by the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries, and with underwriting tonight from the University of Vermont's Humanities Center. The Historical Society and the Library would like to thank our generous sponsors, including the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Mascoma Bank, and Norwich Square Properties. Tonight I'm thrilled to be able to have Bob Taylor here from UVM, who is also on the board of the Vermont Humanities Council, to introduce our speaker.
It's very good to be here. I want to thank the dual hosts of this First Wednesdays program here in Norwich, as has been said, the Norwich Library and the Norwich Historical Society, and also to the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Vermont Humanities Center. As you may know, First Wednesdays happens on a monthly basis, October through May, not only here in Norwich, but in 8 other sites around the state. So tonight, perhaps as many as 1,000 people across Vermont gather to hear and learn from and interact with eminent experts on a wide variety of humanities-related topics. And I might say that none of them are more eminent than our speaker here tonight. The Vermont Humanities Council is not a part of the state government. It is a nonprofit organization that relies in part on private donations to support its work. First Wednesdays is just one of the Council's many programs. The Council offers programs including speakers, reading and discussion programs, and Vermont Reads, our statewide one-book community reading program. We offer these programs because the world of the humanities and the world of books and ideas belongs to everyone, and because engagement with the world of ideas in interaction with others contributes uniquely to richer lives, stronger communities, and a more humane society. And so if you like First Wednesdays and other Vermont Humanities Council programs, I hope you'll support your local library and support the work of the Vermont Humanities Council. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker this evening, my colleague at the University of Vermont. Sadly, he's not in my department. He's in the philosophy department, Professor Tyler Doggett, who is interested in ethics, philosophy of mind, early modern philosophy, and metaphysics. He teaches ethics courses, including courses on altruism, food ethics, parenting ethics, and the ethics of killing various things. He started a program called Public Philosophy Week in 2017, which has grown into the largest public philosophy event in the country, with the idea to spread, in his language, philosophy out of the academy and into the public square. The Vermont Humanities Council is delighted to welcome Professor Doggett to the First Wednesdays series. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tyler Doggett.
Thanks for coming. Thanks to the Vermont Humanities Council for inviting me. When they invited me, they told me I should talk for 45 minutes or so, and then there'd be time for questions, and I'm not going to do that. What I want to do instead is to pose some philosophical questions about parenting, and then talk with you about the best answers to those questions. This isn't a quiz. I don't know the answers myself. I'm here in the hope that we can work it out together. There are many questions we could talk about that I would value talking about, that I need help with, but time is short. We can't talk about all the parenting questions. There'll be nothing in what I say about whether it's permissible to have children at all. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. There'll be nothing in what I say about really practical and pressing issues, like whether it's morally permissible to use this type of diaper or that type of diaper. There'll be nothing in what I say about when you should give your kid a smartphone or have access to social media. I personally would like to know the answers to some of these questions, so feel free to pass them along. we will not be discussing sleep training at any point. Finally, there's nothing in what I'm going to say about one of the most important issues in moral issues in Vermont, namely when and why it's permissible for the Department of Children and Families to take children from their parents. People who come to Vermont Humanities Council talks and people who give such talks probably find themselves quite agitated by family separation issues at the southern border. There's a lot of family separation that goes on within the borders of Vermont. Nearly 1,300 children in our state are in the care of the Department of Children and Families. Nearly 1,200 others are not in DCF's care, but are on DCF's radar in various ways, and many of them are separated from their biological parents. We can talk about that in Q&A too. Okay, enough about what I don't want to talk about. Here's a way into what I do want to talk about. Some children come to Little League baseball more advanced than others. This is for all sorts of reasons. Maybe their parents were good at baseball, or their parents play baseball with them at home. Maybe the kids just love it and they practiced a lot starting at age 4. I don't know. For those kids, Little League baseball is not particularly challenging. However, these children can be challenged by joining a traveling team, an all-star team. In fact, at the end of the Little League season, this is how it is in Burlington, it must be the same in Norwich. At the end of the season, an all-star team is selected. And spots on such a team are limited. The process is quite meritocratic, but not entirely meritocratic. So having a parent who will help with the team is a clear plus, for example. But yeah, it's quite meritocratic, as much as any Burlington, Vermont selection process is. The kids that fill the team initially are typically the kids who come to Little League more advanced than the other kids. Then being on the traveling team catapults these kids farther forward. So whereas regular Little League is once a week, twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, there's something almost every day with all-star teams. And the something there is serious baseball. The players on the all-star team are being challenged, their skills improved, and one predictable result is that the gap between their skills and the skills of the other Little Leaguers, the ones who are not on the all-star team, gets bigger. The next year, there's the same competition for the traveling team, for the all-star team. What's your name with the glasses? Christopher. Christopher, who makes the all-star team the next year? Rich, is this a hard question? The same kids who made it the first year make it the second year. After all, the skills they built on the all-star team last year are significant, and they built on a foundation that was already taller than the foundation the other kids had. So kids who do not make the traveling team initially then have little chance of getting on it. But whether one makes the traveling team initially has a lot to do with factors that are well outside of players' control. I mean, to say nothing of the not entirely meritocratic way the team is initially chosen. In the good of the traveling team, which is not just limited to skill building, the good of the traveling team then ends up being closed off to most kids other than the kids who were initially successful at getting on it. Sorry, drinking thing. On one hand, this situation strikes me as making good sense and providing a genuine good for the children on the all-star team, a good that regular Little League cannot provide for these children. I mean, as I said, the selection process is basically meritocratic. The team is for the kids who are the best at baseball, and the kids who are the best at baseball are in fact mostly the kids who are on the team. And those kids get to play with other kids who are excited about baseball, and not my son who is out in right field eating weeds and wildflowers. This good of being on the all-star team, though, comes at the cost of other children, like children who are deprived of the chance to build these skills, and at least sometimes deprived by factors that they have absolutely no control over. Not just stuff like their genetic endowment, but also stuff like whether their family prioritizes baseball. Moreover, whether you get on that team depends so much on whether you initially get on the team. There's not, with all-star teams, there's just not a lot of possibility for upward mobility or for downward mobility. in that position you get into, either on the All-Star team or not on the All-Star team, it gets locked in very early on. So yes, on the one hand, the system strikes me as making good sense, but on the other hand, it strikes me as there's something unjust about it. I have many questions about this. One question is purely technocratic, which is, can we design a Little League system that secures the goods of the All-Star team without locking in the bads of keeping off kids who start off through no or little fault of their own, off behind that first cohort of All-Stars? Whether or not you think the current system is just, there seems like good reason to build some sort of alternative system like this. Another question is moral, which is the system unjust? I know that people disagree with me about this. One of my best friends, and I should note, he's from Texas, and so he takes youth sports very seriously. He was adamant that there's nothing unjust about the system, that the appearance to me of injustice is illusory. Maybe it's just. But here's a further question. If the system is unjust, how should individual parents respond to this? How should parents deal with this situation? Should they just stick with the system and then work furiously to get their kid on a team, or just accept, it's not going to happen? Should parents instead work to change the system? And it could be then, well, while you're working to change the system, you can also work furiously to get your kid on the team, acknowledging that the current system is unjust. That's a possibility. This is the thing that I'm most interested in and want to talk with you about. And what I'm most interested in is brought out by Little League, but Little League is just one example of the phenomenon. There's a similar state of affairs with regard to academics. Surely the people of Norwich know this. I looked at your test scores. I can't illustrate the phenomenon I'm interested in with regard to Norwich elementary schools for reasons we can discuss in the Q&A. Let's talk instead about Burlington, the school district I live in. In Burlington, some students qualify for free lunch or for reduced price lunch. Some kids don't. I'm going to be very crude here and call the first group, the free and reduced lunch students, poor, and the second group, the non-free and reduced lunch students, rich. In 2017-2018, the last year for which Burlington makes it easy for me to find these numbers, 72% of rich students in the district were proficient on the SBAC literacy test. The SBAC is a statewide test all kids have to take in Vermont in various grades. Okay, 72% of rich students are proficient on the literacy test, whereas only 27% of poor students were proficient. 67% of rich students, there's a typo about this on the handout, 65% of rich students in Burlington were proficient on the SBAC math test, whereas only 21% of poor students were proficient. These numbers are on the handouts. They're evidence of an achievement gap, which is a persistent, measurable disparity between groups. The all-star situation is another sort of achievement gap. Certain kids get picked every year for the team, certain kids don't. There are all sorts of achievement gaps. There's the test score gap I just mentioned, the baseball gap. Some achievement gaps are entirely unobjectionable. So there is, for example, an achievement gap between me and my friend David with regard to skiing. David is just much better at skiing than I am, and if we were administered a skiing test, David would do much better on the test than I do. David skis all the time. I haven't skied in 20 years, and almost always skied in my home state of Ohio, which is a state known for few things, and certainly not mountains or ski culture. So yes, there is an achievement gap with regard to skiing between me and David, but it's entirely unobjectionable. An important detail here is David's from Michigan, which is another state that is not known for mountains or ski culture. So whereas kids from Vermont and New Hampshire have a genuine and unearned advantage when it comes to skiing prowess over kids from Ohio, David, as far as I know, does not have that kind of advantage over me. We had basically the same opportunities. He took his and ran with them. I didn't. So there's an achievement gap between us. Morally speaking, I think it's entirely uninteresting. One reason it's uninteresting is what I just pointed to, which is, in this case, there was genuine equal opportunity, I think, of a kind that's quite rare in life. David and I have roughly the same athletic abilities, as far as I can tell. We had roughly the same chances to ski as children. We had roughly the same parental resources. And yeah, as I said, David took that package and ran, and I didn't. And so there's nothing interesting about the difference between us. I mean, another reason it's uninteresting, I think, is because there's no real cost with regard to skiing. If you aren't good at skiing, fine. Just do something else. I'm better at tennis than David is. So maybe one reason that the baseball gap, I think, doesn't strike anyone as too unsettling is, it's Vermont baseball. Who cares? Not one of these kids is making the major leagues. I actually meant to look this up before the talk, but it's been a long time since someone from Vermont made the major leagues. None of these kids are going to make it. The chances that any of them make a college team is vanishingly small. There are lots of other things these kids could do instead. So even if all-star teams in Burlington are somehow unjustly set up, who cares? It's not a big deal. Another reason the skiing gap, I think, is uninteresting is there's no bottleneck with regard to skiing. So David being good at skiing does not limit my ability to be good at skiing. We aren't competing for a scarce resource. Being good at skiing is something we can both achieve. By contrast, there is a bottleneck with regard to all-star teams. Some children making it really does limit the ability of other children to do that. And so maybe that's why the baseball achievement gap strikes me as, on the one hand, not a very big deal, but on the other hand, it's not nothing, and definitely more important and more morally suspect than the skiing gap. Okay. At the end of the day, I don't care that much about skiing or baseball. I do care a lot about school. I'm a teacher. I have 2 children who are in school. Our academic achievement gaps on standardized tests in Burlington, like the gap between me and David, totally fine. Are they like the gap between the all-stars and the non-all-stars? Maybe a little morally suspicious. Or are they maybe a lot morally suspicious? To help answer this, let's consider a different question, which is what's generating the gap between rich and poor students in Burlington? This is section 3 of the handout. The gap between rich and poor students is complicated, and I am not an expert on this. From the reading I've done, here are some parts of the explanation. They're on the handout. They aren't ranked. First, there is classism against the talents of poor students. Poor students are held to expectations that are lower than the expectations of rich students, and expectations make a difference to how you do in school. Second, there is classism with regard to discipline. The interpretation of misbehavior is sometimes filtered through class, and so what might seem like playful hijinks amongst rich kids can seem like objectionable disrespect amongst poor kids. And then discipline makes a difference to how your kids view whether they belong in a school. And it makes a difference to whether they're spending time in class or whether they're spending time in a principal's office, which in turn makes a difference to how they're doing in school. Third, genetics. The rich people in Burlington are no dummies, and moreover are doctors or lawyers or investment bankers, professors, people whose professions require them to have been very good at taking a test at some point. Fourth, health. As a rule, rich students have fewer untreated dental problems and untreated vision problems than poor students, and dental and vision problems make a difference to school performance, as you can imagine. Actually, just 2 days ago, a new study came out about hearing differences between rich people, rich students and poor students, and again, that makes a very clear difference to how students do in school. Fifth, there's placement both across schools and in classrooms within a school. So for example, richer people can just choose to send their kids to better schools by moving to different districts. And then within those schools, they can choose better teachers. With regard to the second thing especially, only some parents know this happens. And only some of the parents know it's important. And then only some of those parents know which levers to push to change the situation. Relatedly, sixth, there's parental pressure on teachers. Richer parents are typically more interventionist than poorer parents for reasons I'll discuss in a minute. Again, only some parents know that intervening with teachers is even an option. Only some of those parents know it's important. Only some of the parents even know how to do it. Seventh, supplementing during the school year, during the school day, during the summer. Just a side note about supplementing. I still remember the chill I felt when I first heard a parent use that word regarding education. I was at an assembly at a school my kids were attending several years ago. It wasn't in Vermont. A parent was complaining about her son, about her third grader's mathematical ability, and noted that she was, because of the deficiencies of the school, sending the boy to a tutoring center. She said, "I'm supplementing. You have to supplement, you know." And I didn't realize that supplementing was a thing, much less a thing you had to do. And so this chill went through me as I thought about my kids, my sweet little third grader, my sweet little first grader, who had never been to a math tutor, and oh my gosh, how are they gonna get into Dartmouth? They're already so far behind. Okay. Back to the main thread, supplementing. A big difference between rich kids and poor kids is that regardless of whether you have to supplement or not, rich kids do get a lot of supplements. A big difference between rich kids and poor kids is the amount of time that rich kids spend on academics, broadly construed. Not just after-school clubs, not just summer camps. This even comes down to things like reading books to your kids before bed or engaging them in political conversations. Actually, I would love to talk about reading books to your kids in the Q&A. Only some parents are able to supplement like this. Only some parents know that doing this is academically important. Eighth and lastly, cultural fit. In genuinely fascinating work that I recommend on the back of the handout, the sociologist Annette Lareau argues that as a rule, poor parents and rich parents parent differently. Poor parents pursue what Lareau calls accomplishment of natural growth. Rich parents pursue what she calls concerted cultivation. Basically, the children of rich people are bonsai trees. And we cultivate them by intervening in which school they go to, which class they're in, how their teachers treat them. We intervene by sending them to math tutors, reading Harry Potter to them. One of my students just last week told me her dad forced her to listen to The Hobbit at age 4. These things that rich people do for their children, things that we do for our children, I should say, these things we do are rewarded by schools. Whereas poor parents typically think, it's the school's job to teach my kid how to read or to teach them times tables, and so they don't drill them. I remember sitting on an airplane on a long flight next to a mom and a boy who was maybe 3 and would occasionally be allowed to watch a show, but was mostly made on the flight to do flashcards. And I was watching the dumbest stuff, like Mamma Mia maybe, or Anchorman, or Happy Days. And there's this little kid next to me who was doing flashcards. His mom's beautiful little bonsai tree. This lovely and disturbing idea that Annette Lareau has is that rich parents just drill certain sorts of habits into their kids. And those habits are rewarded by schools. Poor parents, by contrast, drill different sorts of habits in, and those aren't rewarded. In fact, they're sometimes punished. I mean, a lack of practice with flashcards is going to cost you. All right, that's my list. Classism, genetics, health, placement in school, placement in classes, pressure on teachers, supplementing, cultural fit. This all adds up to standardized test performance gaps between rich people and poor people, rich kids and poor kids. I mean, the SBAC test is just the tip of the iceberg. Standardized tests are a standard feature of American elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, culminating in the SAT and the ACT. And there are rich-poor gaps all the way through. Here is a vivid way of bringing out how wide the gap is and how it matters. Education level correlates directly and pretty well with income. At least there's this much correlation. People with graduate degrees are typically richer than people without high school diplomas. So consider 2 American populations. from my searching around on the internet, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like something like 25 million Americans have graduate degrees. From my searching around on the internet, it seems that something like 23 million American adults have not completed high school. So there are comparable numbers of Americans with graduate degrees and American adults who have not completed high school. Here comes the horrifying part. In a recent interview about meritocracy, Daniel Markovits was talking about SAT scores. 750 is the median score for an Ivy League admit. Of children, both of whose parents have graduate degrees, 15,000 kids in some recent year got at least a 750. 15,000 kids. Now consider children whose parents have no high school degrees. What's your name with the glasses? Robin? Robin, do you want to guess how many children whose parents have no high school diploma between them got at least one 750? 15,000 kids of parents with graduate degrees got one. How many of the kids whose parents have no high school do you think got at least one 750? What's your best guess? It's not zero, it's above there. Some kids did it. Oh yeah. 32. Yeah, oh look at this, Robin. Amazing, third time's the charm. 32. 32 kids whose parents didn't finish high school got a 750. That's 0.21% of the graduate degree kids. There's something seriously unjust about a system in which it is possible to tell whether a kid will ace the SATs by learning about how much education his parents had. And so a worry about the SBAC test, the Vermont standardized test, is you can make a good guess about how well someone is going to do just by knowing how much money their parents make. There's an achievement gap here. It has a lot to do with factors that are entirely outside of the children's control. It strikes me as more like the achievement gap in the baseball case than in the skiing case, except that if the academic gap is morally objectionable, it's a much bigger deal than the baseball gap. After all, as I was saying, the goods of being on a Little League team in Vermont, an all-star team in Vermont, are not so great. They don't really lead anywhere. But the goods of being good at standardized tests really can lead somewhere. So your third grade literacy test, who cares? But there are other standardized tests. And these other tests lead to gaps with regards to who's in which math class, in which grade. And those gaps lead to gaps with regard to who does well in the SAT math or who takes AP calculus. And that matters a lot to who's getting into Dartmouth. And again, people of Norwich, I don't need to tell you that that's a big deal. Getting into Dartmouth produces enormous goods, goods that cannot be replaced by any experience other than going to other elite American colleges. Some of these are the intrinsic goods of getting to talk about Leibniz or the Odyssey or political liberalism with world-class scholars and motivated, talented peers. Others are the instrumental goods of being in the Dartmouth Alumni Network. These goods are much better than the analogous goods one gets from going to Bob and my school or the University of New Hampshire. Just like with All-Star Baseball, there's a bottleneck here with regard to getting into Dartmouth, but unlike All-Star Baseball, who squeezes through that bottleneck makes a huge difference to the people who squeeze through, and then it can make a huge difference to the people who don't squeeze through. All right, that's the system. There's a technocratic question again about how to design our educational system so that some people aren't doing way better than others simply because their starting point or some other factor entirely outside of their control, like how much money their parents make or whether their parents practice one parenting style or another. But there are also moral questions, and these are on the handout in section 5. Question A, am I right that the situation of rich kids doing so much better than poor kids on a standardized test is unjust? Second, B, if it is unjust, what should individual parents do about that? One reason the second question, question B, is hard one reason it's hard to know what individual parents should do, one reason I think it's hard for rich parents like myself is the goods in question are like genuinely very good goods. And so there's this temptation for me and for other rich people to not do anything. The current system might be unjust, but the system is rigged, but it's rigged in a way that's like benefiting my family. And I worry that this distorts my own response to what I should be doing. Another reason the question of what to do is hard is there's very little that individual parents can do with regard to the system. There is, however, stuff you can do with your own kid. You cannot read to them, or you cannot send them to STEM camp, or you cannot pay for SAT tutoring. That does not improve the system, but it does make your kid less likely to get into Dartmouth. And the thing is, your kid not getting into Dartmouth is not going to open up a spot for a poor kid to get into Dartmouth. Your kid not getting into Dartmouth is just going to open up a spot for your rich neighbor's kid to take. So parents look at the system and they think, oh, there's nothing I can do about that. And then they look at their child and they think, there is something I can do for you. That's another reason the second question strikes me as hard. The first question, question A on the handout, the question about whether the standardized testing state of affairs is just, I actually think that's hard too. I know it's ridiculous to say that. I'm going to regret this being on video. It's ridiculous to look at a system that produces 15,000 750s from one class of rich kids and 32 750s from a comparable class of poor kids. I know it is ridiculous to look at that system and say, oh, that system might be just. And look, at the end of the day, I just want to be very clear about this. I do think the system is unjust. But I think it is sometimes hard to see that, and one reason it's hard to see that is there's a pretty plausible argument against it. Here, think about it like this. There's this American ideal that what's really unjust is stuff like what goes on in France, where not knowing certain manners or not being able to quote certain authors disqualifies you from getting certain goodies. Goodies that actually have nothing to do with manners or quotation. There's this idea that a situation like that is unjust. Whether you know which fork to use is totally irrelevant to whether you deserve a job. Whether you can quote Racine is totally irrelevant to whether you should get into the Sorbonne. That American idea is right. There's also this other idea we have that it's not okay to be racist or sexist or classist. It's not okay, for example, to give students better grades because they're Chinese American or because they're boys or because they're rich. That idea is also correct. But then we make a mistake. We think, well, as long as we clear those obstacles out of the way, clear the ridiculous racism or sexism or classism out of the way, as long as we provide everyone with public school, give them all the same test. It's not like the SAT differs in Mississippi and Vermont. It's not like the SAT differs in the rich parts of Vermont and the poor parts of Vermont. As long as everyone gets the same test, hey, it's up to the kids and their parents to make the best of the system. The American system rewards work ethic and competence. There's nothing objectionable there. If no poor kids take algebra in Burlington, if it's only the kids of doctors at the UVM Medical Center or philosophy professors, that's the fault of the poor kids and their parents. So we think there's no problem, there's no injustice. But think about the lives of some of these rich children. Like people reading to them all the time, pushing them to do extra math summer camp, parents who will engage with teachers, with principals. I mean, look, it's not like some poor parents can't do some of this stuff. I mean, of course they can't do all of it, it's expensive. But they aren't likely to, given this idea that Leroux has about the accomplishment of natural growth parenting philosophy. And the school knows that when they set up the algebra class. They know this when they prepare the tracks for AP Calculus. Dartmouth knows this when they're figuring out which kids from Burlington High School to admit. In Laura Meckler's beautiful recent article in the Washington Post about the achievement gap in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is the town my parents just moved to. She notes that tracking in Shaker starts in 2nd grade. I mean, of course, in some places, it starts even earlier. In New York City, you can test at the age of 4 to get into gifted and talented programs. And of course, there are tutors you can help with this. You can start your 2-year-old young. This is all to say, this is on section 4 of the handout. These test scores don't look to me like they were produced by people with equal opportunities. And they look like cases where how you do gets locked in pretty early. They look like cases where only a few people can get the goodies and where these goodies are so good. Here's a way to think about this debate about injustice. On the one hand, this really is not France. It is not the kids who have the best manners or who know Racine who get into school. The kids who do the best on the test get in. There's a really pure example about this in New York City regarding the SAT test. The kids who do the best get in. Everyone knows about the test, so it's meritocratic. That's how it should be. That's one idea. But on the other hand, consider this remarkable example from Bernard Williams, one that Richard Reeves cites in his interesting and unsettling book, Dream Hoarders. Quote, suppose that in a certain society, great prestige is attached to membership of the warrior class, the duties of which require great physical strength. This class has in the past been recruited from certain wealthy families only, but egalitarian reforms achieve a change in the rules by which warriors are recruited from all sections of society on the results of a suitable competition. The effect of this, however, is that the wealthy families still provide virtually all the warriors, because the rest of the populace is so undernourished by reason of poverty that their physical strength is inferior to that of the wealthy and the well-nourished. The reformers protest that equality of opportunity has not really been achieved here. The wealthy reply that, in fact, it has. The poor now have the opportunity of becoming warriors. It's just bad luck that their characteristics are such that they don't pass the test. We are not, the rich might say, excluding anyone for being poor. We exclude people for being weak. And it's unfortunate that those who are poor are also weak. Unquote. You might worry that academic achievement gaps on standardized tests are produced like this. They're a way to lock in certain goods. And locking in that good lets you, to use Richard Reeves' words, opportunity hoard. Rich people really do get into Dartmouth at absurd rates compared to poor people. I mean, when the New York Times studied this in 2017, they found that Dartmouth has more students from the top 1% of the income scale than the bottom 60% of the income scale. And yet, as a parent, you might find yourself in a position, whether or not you're in the top 1%, Reeves is actually obsessed with the top 20%. If you're in the top 20%, you might find yourself in a position where you have a choice between opportunity hoarding or not. You see this enormous good that hoarding can produce for your kid. You see what little effect you have on the system as a whole. You know that work you can do to make things better for other people's children will come at the cost of tending to your own bonsai tree. And you know full well that all of your rich neighbors are just attending to their own bonsai trees. In this situation, it's difficult to practice what Martin Luther King called dangerous unselfishness, and to risk the well-being of yourself and your own kid for the well-being of others. But that is something you can do. Should you do that? That's what I want to talk about. Thank you. Does anyone have questions or ideas?
The system, I think, is unjust.
No.
But I think the question isn't so much do you have to either decide as an individual to help your own children or to help all the children? We can make the system more just. So if we raise the floor, that doesn't change the ceiling.
Yeah.
But that's the way I think I would prefer that we form that question. And that's how you work on it, is how you make the poor children have a better chance.
No, I agree completely. I did not mean to suggest that I was opposed to that.
No, the way you framed it, it makes, at least I was thinking, oh, I helped my kids get into college. They didn't go to Dartmouth, but I helped my kids get into college. Right. And it's not that I wasn't working for other people's children too.
Right.
So I maybe have a little bit of cognitive dissonance there, that I can separate my own children, but we can make the system, we know how to make the system better for all the kids. The 32 kids got the 750, so the other 14,966.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the presence of 32 is important because it shows that a certain thing is possible. That's true. That's very important. And yeah, I agree completely. So I don't want to fixate too much on achievement gaps themselves, even though, of course, I put it on the handout. Achievement gaps themselves actually are not super interesting to me. What's really troubling to me is not the gap between poor students and rich kids, it's the fact that the poor students are doing so badly. Like, if you had a case where you could close the achievement gap by dropping down all the rich people, so that only 32 rich people got the same score, that would also be a deeply troubling situation, even though there would be no gap anymore.
My wife's trying to get me to tell you about how you raise the scores, but
He's got a plan.
I was principal at White River. We had 43% free and reduced lunch students. They didn't have the SBAC back then. It was the NSREs.
Yeah.
Every couple of years, we beat the Norwich school. We danced in
Really?
the hallways.
Really? I mean, the thing is, I said I would talk about it in Q&A. The Norwich Elementary School is very impressive.
They are.
But you would beat them, even though you had
Only
43%.
twice out of 10 years, but
20%
we
of
were
the time
close.
is pretty good.
And there were ways we could do that.
Oh, fascinating. Christopher, I would like to hear about
And
this.
we didn't spend, well, it was the people, but that's my point is you have to figure out, and I'll throw out the easiest thing, you get parents to talk to their children.
Yeah.
Poor kids come in with 1,400 words in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
Wealthy kids come in with 2,800
Yeah.
4-year-olds in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
So you talk.
Yeah.
That's cheap. I'm going to give this away.
Yeah. We can talk, right? Yeah, we can talk.
I like
What's your name?
it's Philip. I like the challenge you give, though, in terms of and this is something that I think is incumbent for all of us privileged people, is to be aware of our privilege and see how it works out individually in our own lives, and then challenges us to address the issue of unfairness and injustice, both with our money and with our time and energy. Yeah. So if we've got recognize that we have privilege, say in education, then it's incumbent upon us, I think, from an ethical point of view, to do something about it, and not just accept it and accept the system. You got to change the system, but it may also mean that the money that you spend on your kids' special education, you might decide, maybe I ought to give a portion of that to such and such.
Right. Yeah, Philip, I agree with all that. Thank you.